We're going to have a panel discussion on basically, I guess, for lack of a better term, the state of the industry. And we have a series of prepared questions, and the format is I will pose the questions, and hopefully if everything goes according to plan, Paul and Phil will answer them. And hopefully not giving the same answer. And we're going to alternate between who goes first. So the first question, and I'll pose this first to Paul, is the Insurance Council of BC has recently published a notice highlighting the roles and responsibilities of MGAs in the distribution of life insurance in British Columbia. What is your opinion of the significance of this document and the potential impact on advisors and MGAs?
Nobody told me they published a notice. No, that's a joke. Well, first of all, it's very nice to be here. I've seen a lot of familiar faces, old faces I haven't seen in a while, so it's great to be here. It's great to be up here with Jack. It makes me feel young again. And Phil, being up here with Phil, it's funny. This morning I got a phone call. To start my morning at about 5:25. I live in North Van at Grand Boulevard, and is this answering the question? At Grand Boulevard and 15th, and there was a fire engines and emergency vehicles, and there was a car that was on fire, and so there was two fire trucks, and so that woke me up. And then at 5:35, I get a phone call, and it's from a gentleman from Canada Life, and he says, and I said hello, and he said, "Is this Paul?" I said, "Yeah," and he goes on, and then. He said the reason he phoned me at 5:35 in the morning, he thought I was in Florida. And the reason he thought I was in Florida, because he knew I was with Phil. And he just thought, Phil's always in Florida, so that's where he expected I was. So anyways, it's nice to have Phil on this side of the border today. So anyways, on that note.
I'll be professional, not say anything.
The paper that came out from the Insurance Council, they had been working on that for a number of years. Jerry Mateer, as you may or may not know, he's been our executive director for 20 years, and he's in my opinion, done a great job. And he's always proactive, because one of the problems with regulators in Canada is that they work provincially, but they try to work nationally. And when they work nationally, it takes them forever to do anything, basically. And the CCIR, which is the Canadian Council of Insurance Regulators, which is a group of sort of like insurance councils, and I think in Ontario it's called FISCO, which is the Financial Services Commission. They will also work with some of the superintendents across Canada and CCR. So they've been looking at the MGA distribution channel. And they've been doing that for a few years. And Jerry basically said, well, enough's enough. Like, let's get on with this. So he basically, and what I respected about what Jerry did is he did a lot of due diligence. Being part of CALB, I worked quite closely with them, and we were able to sort of educate him on the MGA business and the independent advisor business, because surprisingly, regulators knew little or nothing about the MGA business, even though it's been around for 40 years. And I think the paper was, from a CALB perspective and from an MGA perspective, we were very happy, because first of all, it did recognize that MGAs exist, which is important, and it also gave them a clear indication of what MGAs do and what they don't do. And really, what from my perspective, I think the paper really, quite honestly, spoke more to advisors than it spoke to MGAs, and it really sort of set down some ground rules for how advisors will do business through MGAs and how MGAs will interact with insurance companies. Jerry Mateer sort of firmly believes that the MGA is an extension of the insurance company, an agency of the insurance company, and that it's really the MGA's role to, although we can't supervise the daily activities of advisors, we do see their transactions, and we have to be able to monitor and to make decisions. And one of the interesting things that came out of it is that he made it very clear to the MGA community, if you see advisors that are behaving or conducting themselves in their conduct is not the best quality, that he wants us to report them to the Insurance Council. So in the old days, it would be if someone was a bad advisor, they went somewhere else, and you just let the insurance companies worry about it. But now there's an onus on the MGA community to make sure that the advisors they're dealing with have integrity and are conducting themselves properly.
Good. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me here. It's always nice coming to sunny Vancouver. This is probably the second time in my life that I've been in Vancouver and I haven't seen the sun, so I was a bit surprised, and I called Paul yesterday and said, what's going on? And it wasn't 5:30 in the morning when I called him. What's going on with this rain? So it was surprising. Anyway, so it's good to be here. So just to address that question on the paper that came out from the BC regulator, quite honestly, in my opinion, it's a little too early to say how that's going to really impact. There's a lot of work that's being done right now, and as I was introduced, I'm on one of the CLHIA committees, and we're working closely there with CALBA and obviously with the regulators, and we're discussing really what the role of an MGA should be, because there's a bit of a divergence, in my opinion, as to what the MGA does, and when you're trying to define it, it becomes extremely difficult. But I think we can identify, what they do is what we have to focus on. And when we see an MGA, we all know what it looks like, but putting it into paper, defining is a little bit more challenging. And what's critical is that we need to work with CALBA, and again, with the regulators, in understanding what their role is in working with advisors. And at the end of the day, what's critical is that the consumer has to get the right advice. And there's a lot of advisors, they do a great job in the industry, and things are okay. Every once in a while, you hear those issues where somebody hasn't done the right thing. And that's where I think we need to work closely together, as Paul mentioned, between the carriers, the regulator, and the MGAs to identify those that aren't working with the client's best interests and deal with those individuals that has an impact to the industry. And I think that's really one of those things that has to be defined at this stage. It's what is their role and how do we identify these advisors? How do we make sure the advisors are well-trained and doing what's right for the consumer?
Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Paul. I have a question. If you read the notice that came out from the Insurance Council and you go through it, there seems to be kind of a message that they're looking for the MGAs to probably provide a much higher level of regulation and compliance than they've done in the past. Not necessarily MGAs were reluctant to do compliance, but there wasn't anything regulated in that area. Do you think that there will be an increased requirement of the MGAs to provide more and more levels of compliance? And if so, do you anticipate that this will ultimately result in lower payouts to the advisors?
That's a loaded question. From my perspective, absolutely. Like at IDC World Source Insurance Network, we now have a chief compliance officer across Canada. So even though we have a MFDA dealer and an IROC dealer, we have a chief compliance officer whose sole purpose is to supervise the compliance activities of the MGA. So, from our perspective, there's no question that we're already there. And I think, really what Jerry Mateer has said is that you've got to know your advisor. And to know your advisor, you have to be able to monitor their business and look at, you just don't take the paper, photocopy it or scan it and send it off. You have to have the ability to, as we all know, most applications are going to be very, very straightforward. But from time to time, you're going to get situations where applications aren't straightforward. And you have to have the ability, and your staff has to be trained to be able to recognize certain situations and escalate them if necessary. And we will definitely be responsible. And I think the MGA community, CALBA just came out with what they call a compliance toolbox, which is basically a turnkey approach for MGAs across Canada to have a compliance regime in their office. So, we're being proactive to make sure that the regulators see us as being compliance oriented, and because if we're not, our advisors aren't, then the regulators are going to come lay the hammer down, and we're going to be like the MFDA.
In my opinion, the compliance situation has been around for a long time, and it's not just at the MGA level. Really, it's also at the advisor level. As you know, with FINTRAC and the PIPEDA, the Privacy Act, and the AML, anti-money laundering, we're getting calls now from some MGAs or some advisors that are being audited today to make sure that they've got their systems in place. So that compliance environment already exists there, and I encourage you to make sure you've got some processes in place to identify those. Now, they're not asking for you to make a declaration whether or not it's a suspicious activity or a suspicious transaction. It's whether it looks like one, and then let the regulator deal with that. That's one aspect of it. I think from a compliance point of view, from a sales practice, I think there's some merit there. From where I sit, we as a carrier get to see only the business that comes to us from the advisors through the MGA. As the MGA, they may be dealing with an advisor that deals with more than just one company. So they'll be able to monitor some of the activity that goes on, whether it's going from one company A to B to C every so often, and is it in the client's best interest. So I think there are some issues there, and that's where, as Paul was mentioning, you need to understand what your advisors are doing and what kind of practices they are, and where's the best interest for the client.
I didn't answer that commission question, so I should. I think that where I see where we're at right now, I don't think that I'm fairly confident that the compliance infrastructure in the insurance business is not going to be as rigorous as draconian as it is in the securities business. So, if we can work with insurance companies and work with advisors to make sure that we're continuing to operate effectively and treat the consumers properly, I think we can kind of avoid having a really heavily costed compliance structure. But that's going to be up to all of us in this room to make sure that happens. And if that happens, I don't think advisor compensation is going to be affected greatly. But if at some point, the regulators come down and say, you guys aren't regulating yourself, we're going to do it for you, and you get a situation where you've got a rules-based regulatory regime where you've got to hire 10, 15 compliance officers, that's going to affect everybody's compensation.